Well, as many of you know, my name is Glenn Yeager from the Milken Institute. Just a very brief introduction to set the tone for this really critically important panel. I want to thank Ambassador Ken Quinn and Mark Kahn as well, and the early discussions we had that gave formation to this panel. That builds off of much of the work we've done on financial innovations, and thanks to Caitlin McLean, who runs our Financial Innovations Labs, that we've done with the Gates Foundation and others that have focused on some of these issues about food security. But first, just to set the right tone, there's been a whole movement around the issue of agriculture in Africa, and we just wanted to start off with a very brief 1 minute. You can watch the longer musical video at the end when they finish. So let it rip. That's not a music video.
Oh. It's got a good beat. You can dance to it. So
that was Henry Kissinger.
I give it a 7. You guys are too young to remember Dick Clark and American Bandstand.
Oh, this beats it by.
You know, that's what happens when you get old.
You got it, Jason? Okay, and then Ken, you take it.
You got it. School. Well, so let's have a hand for the one organization. I was expecting Bono was going to come on, and
you might as well.
That's it. So, hi, my name's Ken Quinn. I'm president of the World Food Prize. I know what all of you are thinking and asking. What's the World Food Prize? Everyone says. So, I just want to take a couple of minutes and show you and tell you just a little bit about it. So, if you put up slide 36 for me, the World Food Prize. That's all right. So it's a $250,000 prize, referred to, and I never disputed, as the Nobel Prize for food and agriculture. And even more importantly, if you put up slide 37, it was started by Dr. Norman Borlaug, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, the man, if you put up slide 38, who working in Mexico, India, Pakistan, brought the Green Revolution in the 1960s when all of South Asia was faced with, Mark knows from being there, the great prospect of massive famine. And he's referred to as the man who saved more lives than anyone who's ever lived. And Borlaug started the World Food Prize because he couldn't convince the Nobel Committee to start a Nobel Prize for agriculture. And he died in 2009, but a month ago in Washington, D.C., if you put up slide 39, his statue was unveiled in Statuary Hall of the U.S. Capitol. Yeah, oh, thank you. And it was a great moment. He's right next to Rosa Parks there, two people from very humble background who changed the world and affected millions and millions of people, what they did. Dr. Borlaug started the World Food Prize, and each year in October, people come to Des Moines. If you put up slide 40, when we take over the state capitol, a friendly takeover, and the minister, and we give the prize. Our laureates come from around the world. Slide 41, if you would. So here in 2012, Daniel Hillel, our laureate from Israel, was there, and the man to his right, Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations. And put up the 42. We put on the same time the Borlaug Dialogue Conference. We're a small nonprofit. There's only 10 of us in our organization, but we get about half as many people as here. We get about 1,500 people who come from about 65 or 70 countries, and they spend 3 days in Iowa with us. And put up the next slide. And so you see we have Tony Blair, Bill Gates, Kofi Annan, but we also have smallholder farmers, pastoralists who come from Africa. We have research scientists, CEOs who are there. And this October, I want to invite you all to come, October 15, 19, for our symposium we call the Borlaug Dialogue. And our topic is the greatest challenge in human history. Can we sustainably and nutritiously feed the 9 billion people who will be on this planet, given all of the other issues of water scarcity that we face, of climate volatility, of marginal lands, no more land to be brought in. And so as we do this, our themes are going to be in our discussion: intensification, innovation, and inspiration. And that's what this panel is here today. We are going to have to, Dr. Borlaug would put it this way: if you took all of the grain that human beings have grown in the last 11,000 years, since that first farmer in the Fertile Crescent, almost certainly a woman, I think, there, and planted that first seed, and if you imagine nobody ate anything, but you took all of that and made one huge pile, he would say, that's what we have to do in the next 50 years. So we better get busy on this. So we have a panel that reflects an array of countries and areas around the world, an array of specialties who are here. When Glenn Yago called me and invited me to come, and he said, well, who should we have on the panel? He said, I have some ideas. And I said, well, if you're only going to invite one person, I would invite the Honorable Minister of Agriculture of Nigeria, Akinwumi Adesina, is here. I'm proud to say my good friend as well. One of the, I'm close to Tom Vilsack, the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, is our governor in Iowa. But when I think of who are the most dynamic ministers and secretaries of agriculture in the world, I think of course, Secretary Vilsack and Minister Adesina. And so I'm so pleased that he could be here today. And I was so thrilled to hear Scott Meinhard say at that session about how he would invest long-term investments in Africa, one of the great growth regions of the world. And then to hear Tony Blair speak about his fondness and affection. Tony Blair and Howard Buffett are the major partners with me and the World Food Prize in something called 40 Chances, which we are endeavoring to inspire startups in Malawi, Rwanda, President Kagame was here, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. And next October, I'm going to give away $150,000 to 4 individuals. If you know anybody, have them go to my website. There's still a month to apply on that. But to start our panel, I want to turn to the minister who's doing such great things in Nigeria. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. First and foremost, let me thank you very much for inviting me here, and also to thank the Milken Institute for having me here. This is such an important meeting that even though I was actually not feeling well, I told my staff, absolutely I had to be here, because I think there couldn't be a bigger and more relevant group to speak to about global agriculture than the one actually you gathered here. So so pardon my voice, but it's just because of that. Let me say that I'm a great admirer of Dr. Norman Borlaug. He's the greatest human being that I know that I ever lived, because I don't know of anybody else that fed more than 1 billion people. And he actually was a mentor of myself. It was a mentor of mine. Now, as you thought about, spoke about the feeding the next 9 billion people in the world by the year 2050, I think we need to ask ourselves the question, where will that land be? Or where is that land to feed the 9 billion people in the world? And what types of productivity growth shifts must we have to achieve that? I think 65% of all that land to feed the world is actually not in Latin America. It's not in America. It's not in Europe. It's not in Asia. It's actually in Africa. And so the critical issue then is we've got to make agriculture to work in Africa in a way that's different. Not as a way of life, not as a social sector, but agriculture as a business. Whether you're in seed or fertilizer or in storage or logistics or transport, everything about agriculture is a business. So the fundamental thing we first have to shift is in Africa, where that frontier is going to be, is begin to take agriculture as a business and grow it as a business. Second thing, and most important, is recognize that in terms of investments, and you're all investors in this room today, with the rapid population growth you have in Africa, urbanization, income growth. Now, people eat food. They don't drink oil. They don't smoke gas, And so the key is investing in Africa, in food production, in food processing, value addition is the key going forward. Now, for us, when I became minister about 2.5 years ago, I found that agriculture had been treated for so long as a development activity. Well, we have in Nigeria 85 million hectares of land, of which no more than 10% is actually utilized optimally. So in terms of best technology. So the first thing that we had to do was to get the government out of the business of agriculture. Because it's not the job of government. The job of government, as far as I'm concerned, is to do good policies and good incentives, good regulations, good infrastructure, public good provision, that's it. But then the private sector, you guys that are in the room today and many more, are the ones that are the engine of growth. And so we decided to use the private sector to unlock the potential of agriculture. Dr. Bullock always said you can't eat potential, so we can't eat it either. So we decided to do that. And what happened for us is phenomenal. First and foremost is that we took the government out of a seed sector monopoly. And within 2 years, the number of seed companies in Nigeria grew from 5 when we started almost 3 years ago to 80 seed companies today. If you look at it in terms of the proportion of our farmers that are using all the hybrid technologies like you have in Iowa or Illinois or anywhere else, it went from roughly 500,000 metric tons of seed they were using 3 years ago to 50,000 metric tons of seed today. You look at amount of farmers, 5% when we started. Today, half of the farmers all across the country are using hybrid improved technology. So that just tells you what happens when the government gets out of the way and gives incentive to the private sector. We've been, Ambassador, in the last 2.5 years, been able to leverage big companies like Syngenta into Nigeria, DuPont, as you know. Monsanto, as I speak, is actually in Nigeria. We've also been able to get roughly $4 billion of private sector investment into the sector. So I think I'm just saying that so that you know that the growth frontier, yes, is in Africa, but it's going to take a different type of agriculture to take that. The second point I want to make really has to do with not with biological technologies, but with information and communications technology. I think the most powerful tool in the hand of any farmer in the world today, it's really their mobile phone. And you go to Africa today, the penetration of mobile phone is phenomenal. In Nigeria, we have more mobile phones than television sets in the country. So when I became minister, I figured out that the fastest way to reach the farmers and to cut out all the middlemen and the corruption in the system was to just go over their mobile phones. So we put in place something called the electronic wallet scheme, in which the government was sending electronic vouchers for subsidies for seeds and fertilizers to our farmers via mobile phones instead of government buying and selling fertilizers. Well, it was an instant revolution for us. In 2 years, we reached 8 million farmers directly by mobile phones. We went from less than 10% of our farmers getting the inputs under the old government-driven system to 80 to 90% of the farmers getting it today. Now, this has allowed our farmers to improve food security for 40 million people, just within 2 years. So I think the power of mobile phone technology combined with biological technology is key for going forward. Now, the third point I want to make also has to do with finance, and you're all finance people here. Well, let's not forget that Africa may be called a poor. We may have a lot of poor people, but Africa is by no means a poor continent. 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. Nigeria just rebased its economy. We're the largest economy today in Africa. But the key is we've got excess liquidity sitting on the balance sheet of our banks. So it's not about getting more donor aid. It's about leveraging the excess liquidity we have on the balance sheet of our banks into agriculture as a business. And that's what we decided to do in Nigeria. 2 years ago, we started a major risk-sharing facility with the Reserve Bank of Nigeria to lower the risk of lending by banks into agriculture. We set up that fund. It was, I think, roughly $350 million to leverage $3.5 billion, not of donor money, but of our own money sitting on our balance sheet of our banks into agriculture. It's been, again, a massive transformation for us. We went 3 years ago, almost 0.7% of lending was going to agriculture. Today, 5% of total lending in the country is going to agriculture. And whether it's seed companies, last year seed companies got $53 million. fertilizer companies got $500 million. It just tells you what happens about the potential of agriculture when we do all of that. So, Ambassador, those are the initial points that I wanted to make.
Okay. Thank you, Minister. Thank you so much. And that, as you can tell, the Minister is a great communicator. And he won a couple of years ago and received at the World Food Prize the CAST Communication Award. The next year, the award recipient was Jeff Simmons, who you know was to be here today. He's the CEO of Elanco, and contacted me just a day ago and said something had come that he just couldn't be here. And I'm so sorry, because he is equally a dynamic person and that. But he sent Claudia Garcia, who's a friend of the World Food Prize, like the minister, has spoken at our conference. And she is a senior director at Elanco Animal Health, director of marketing, worked in Canada, North America, Latin America, brings that perspective to our panel. So Claudia, so glad you could be here today.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And you can imagine then how I felt when I heard that I was going to replace Jeff Simmons in this panel. I'm going to try my best. We heard that we're going to, all of us are going to live in between 7 and 9 billion people. All of us and our kids will do that. And from those 9 billion people, 3 billion will be coming from emerging markets, will become middle class at some point in time. And what that means is a higher demand of animal protein, of milk, meat, and eggs, about 60%. So if we use, and if we can use the first slide on the milk set. There you go. So we will require 60% more milk and meat and eggs in the upcoming years. If we go to the next one, please. So I'm going to use milk as an example, a very simple example. We have almost double the productivity in dairy production, and yet we have right now 14% less milk available per person than what we had in 1961. And if we know, next slide please, if we use a very simple formula that says we are right now all able to consume 1 glass of milk, 8-ounce glass like this one, and experts recommend that for proper nutrition we get 2 glasses a day, then if you add up the amount of having 2 glasses per person across the globe, 9 billion people, we are very quickly adding up to having close to 40 million more cows by 2050. 40 million more cows in 2050. So if we go to the next slide. So let's use a very simple example. If 1 cow produces about, in general, 2 gallons of milk, or the equivalent to 32 glasses per day, it only takes for each one of those cows to produce half a glass more, half a cup more, what can be in that cup more per cow to supply all that demand. And we can do it very easily. If we go to the next one. If we use innovative solutions, products, practices, services that can be used, and I'm not talking about big complicated stuff. I'm talking about access to filtered water for those cows, improving their diets, getting them access to vaccinations and products that can keep them healthy, and also simple things like proper housing and comfort for those animals. And that is important not only because we can close the gap, but we can also freeze the footprint of those animals. And if we do that combined, we could potentially reduce about 66 million cows by 2050. And I don't know you, but I don't want 60 or 40 million more cows because of the environmental impact that can create. So if we use innovative solutions, we can save as much as 388 million fewer acres of land that wouldn't have to be used to produce the feed for those cows, which is the size of Alaska. And we can save as much as 618 billion gallons of water, which is the equivalent of the in-house water needed for 11 cities in the US, Los Angeles included, or the combination of the UK, Germany, and France together, the water that they need on a yearly basis. So it's very important. We don't have enough water and land to use, and we can save it if we appropriately use basic innovation. If we go to the next slide, so why milk? Why does it matter? Why we have to think about milk? This is a chart that shows the results of a study in Kenya that allow for children to have access to meat, milk, and oils as part of their diet. And they were tested across 5 scholar years. And you can see the results there. When they were added in their diet, they had additional protein from meat or milk. Why is that important? Because we're talking about brain development, we're talking about leadership, we're talking about those kids becoming better. And it's not only in Africa, it can be in Latin America, it can be in Asia, it can be in Los Angeles, here around the corner. So the study confirms that the quality of the calories is also as important as the quantity of the calories. And in Elanco, we do believe, if we go to the next slide, we do believe that we can provide a food secure world that is possible if we focus on 3 areas. Innovation, as I mentioned, we can do it with basic and also with innovative solutions. Also with trade, where the food can go from places where it's produced in an efficient manner to those areas that can't produce fast enough. And also with choice, very importantly, by allowing farmers to use the production systems that they consider is the right one for them. And it can be, again, yet here in California, or it can be in another country. Make the choices they need, and most importantly, for consumers to be able to choose what they want for either their lifestyle or their culture.
So, you see, the minister, he wants to turn those smallholder farmers who are just marginal producers into business persons, I should say business women and businessmen, and that they're producing more. With Claudia, want to close the nutrition gap. The same number of cows, but if you can get them to half again, increase their production, that's an amazing amount that can be done. Don't have more land. You don't necessarily need to double or triple the number of cows.
Correct.
Just make them more productive. And that Doron Gal, the CEO of Kaima, an Israeli firm, also, when you get down to those farmers, he wants them to have plants and seeds that can produce even more yield, even more food. So please, tell us how you're doing it.
Thanks.
I'm a political science guy, and I can't always understand this, so make it simple for me.
Sure. So if I start with the example that you gave of Norman Borlaug's piles of wheat. So obviously in the next 50 years, that was, when was that? 50 years, it was about 7-8 years ago?
Yeah, so it was in the 40s and 50s, and he said it at year 2000.
Right. So I think we have about 42 years left to produce an amount of grain that is equivalent to the amount that was produced for the past 10,000 years since the beginning of agricultural society. So clearly we need to improve efficiency. We need to improve our productivity. And we need to produce more with less, because we have less water. We have less and less arable land because of soil degradation. Climate is unstable, and that's a major challenge. For every degree rise in temperature, we're projected to lose about 10% efficiency in agricultural production. So clearly, something that is not being done today needs to be done by new innovators. And that's where we try to be. we chose as a strategy to borrow from a master strategist from nature. And what we saw is, and what we observed is that when things get tough for natural plant populations, they have a very effective evolutionary mechanism to deal with this circumstance. And that's through a process of genome doubling. And the scientific word for that is polyploidy. And genome doubling for the plants, it's really successful strategy because it gives two very important things to this plant population. One, it produces more robust plants, more robust individual plants through this natural evolutionary process. And those more robust plants are better able to cope with whatever trouble they're facing. The second thing is that genome multiplication, for various reasons, genetic reasons, allows plants to cross, to hybridize with quite distant relatives. And in this way produce diversity, produce new types. And when you do that, that's always a good strategy in evolution. When you produce more and more types, then some will be able to survive better. So that's what we've done. And if you can put up slide number 50, please. Slide 50. Yeah, right. So that slide relates to what I've just said, and you can see in the center panel this concept of genome multiplication, creating more than one copy of the plant chromosomes. And then please go to slide 51. The poster child for this process is bred wheat. And when Norman Borlaug speaks about 10,000 years ago, beginning of human agriculture, that began because of a natural evolutionary process of genome multiplication, polyploidy, and distant hybridization. And out of relatively humble parents, not very productive plants like mother of wheat, we were fortunate to receive bred wheat somewhere in the Fertile Crescent. So we follow, again, this kind of strategy, and on the left side, or the picture on the left, you can see regular wheat, and on the right, an example of the wheat that we're producing with more chromosomes. The technology, by the way, is a non-GMO technology because, again, it emulates some natural processes that plants undergo over time, just doing it faster in a more directed fashion. We're still developing this technology. It's got very big potential, we believe. We're still validating it. So it's still early days for Caima, but if you can go to the next slide, slide 52. I want to share with you some early results that we have, and I like this data set because it illustrates both the ability of genome multiplication to increase the yield in the absolute, but also increase the adaptability of the plant to different climates, which is, again, very natural to expect from this process. And this is a data set that was collected by one of our partners in India, and we tested a rice variety that is actually not suitable for India at all. It's suitable for China. And our best result, the best genome multiplied variety that we had, provided a 60% yield increase, which is huge. And out of that, we estimate that 25% is just a baseline improvement because the plant is more robust as a result of this process that we have. And about 35% of the yield increase reflects just a better adaptability of this plant that was supposed to function in China, but now it can function in a very different environment in India. So just an example of what we're developing and what we're doing in Caima.
Okay. Thank you, Darren. Mark Kahn, I got to know last year at the World Food Prize, as a dynamic speaker and businessman, but I also have a great deal of admiration for him because he then stayed on after at our youth institute, spent a whole day working with these high school students that we bring in so they can rub shoulders with people like Minister Adesina and CEOs like Jeff Simmons. And then I met him again at the FFA convention in Louisville, where he's again working with youth. So Mark is the co-founder of Omnivore Partners, working in India. So we've had Africa, Israel, working in India, and on early startups. And I didn't say projects, so I'd be pleased, and lives in Mumbai and has done some really remarkable things like SkyMet and that. So, Mark?
Sure. Very nice to be here. Thank you all for coming. So we've talked about growing rice and wheat, and I'm going to talk for a few minutes about growing entrepreneurs. That is essentially what I do and what a growing number of dedicated venture funds do globally. So if we can hit slide 45, I think. Wild guess. Yeah. So basically, agricultural technology over the course of the last decade has evolved into a space where there is a niche of venture capital and startups. There have always been venture-backed entrepreneurs in ag tech and food tech. What we have today is basically a critical mass. If you are to generalize a little bit about what is getting funded by some of these VCs, I would say it's pretty much 5 major themes, and these link intimately with what is required for global food security. Global food security has 2 components. One is the big producers globally, right? The U.S., Canada, Brazil, the artist formerly known as Ukraine, right? Being able to produce more, being able to bump up their yields substantially. It's also about countries that are food insecure, China, India, Nigeria, being able to close off the requirement for imports, being able to produce what they need domestically. There are 2 pieces of this, with the last little twist being that climate change has taken all of this and tossed it up in the air because we don't know from year to year where drought is going to hit, where unseasonal floods are going to hit. And as a result, global agriculture has been on tenterhooks for the last decade, and the next 2 decades look worse. So the 5 big themes of ag tech have been genetics, right, which is essentially seeds and traits. Kaima is a great example of a startup in the genetic space. There are others, right? Sustainable inputs. Globally, and I'm saying this as a former Syngenta employee, right? Globally, everyone is aware that highly toxic pesticides are a legacy and that we are moving away from that towards, right, microbial inputs, right, towards other sustainable inputs, towards pheromone traps. There are a number of ways to do this better, towards integrated pest management, predatory insects. And so you're seeing a lot of startups in that space get funded. Big data, right? Big data is a theme that venture capitalists have been geeking out on, right, across sectors, right? Whether it's machine-to-machine learning or whether it's things related to consumer statistical analysis. The great thing about agriculture is we throw off massive amounts of data, right? The trick is that nobody until recently has started using it, right? But today we live in a world where we can take the readings off a combine thresher, right? We can take meteorological data, right? And we can start actually mapping out how a given plot, right, say 50 hectares or 100 hectares produces differently based on variable rates of inputs. And it's transforming how agriculture works. So big data is a big part of this. Precision agriculture, right? Again, kind of also on the same theme. There are more, agriculture is only becoming more and more automated. One of the problems, we saw the video at the beginning about agric. One of the problems that we face in the developing world, right, is that basically if you and I went to a village anywhere in India, from Srinagar to Kanyakumari, doesn't matter. I've done this over and over and over again anytime I have a farmer meeting, right? And you ask the question, how many of you want your children to be in agriculture? The answer is less than 10%. And then you go ask the kids the same question, and it's the same response, right? So one of the things that we face is it's not just a world of 85-year-old Japanese farmers, right, and the graying out of the American Midwest. It's a world where young people in the developing world, in countries where agriculture represents 50% of the labor force, they don't want to be a part of it. So one of two things have to happen. One is it's got to become a lot more profitable, and God willing it will. The other side of it is we've got to automate. We've got to pull labor out of agriculture and create something where one person can manage larger amounts of land. We're seeing a lot of startups in that. And finally, innovative foods, right? Food processing is a huge part about the transformation of global agriculture. It's also about the fact that globally diets are changing. So whether you're looking in China and India, where it's about increasing the protein in diets, or whether it's America taking a look at its diabetes and obesity and saying, wait a second, this doesn't work anymore, it's killing us. This is a transformation we're seeing everywhere. I wanted to put this all on one slide. Flip to the next one. So here's the story, and I'm appealing to everyone in this room who's an investor. In each of these segments, you're seeing hot, exciting startups. And when I say startups, I mean the same thing you see in every other sector of the entrepreneurial innovation economy, except here they're focused on agricultural technology and food technology, and not, as I pejoratively joke, naked selfie apps. Okay. There's a lot of VCs in the world that fund naked selfie apps. There are about 10 VCs globally. Two of us are sitting here that essentially fund breakaway technologies for ag tech and food tech, right? So if you go to seeds and genetics, there you can see a few examples, right? Arcadia and Kaima, which both work with global seed companies, different technologies. Arcadia is much more GM, you're non-GM, right? SG Biofuels, which is revolutionizing Jatropha. If you go to sustainable inputs, Vesteron, which works with spider venom, right, and creates synthetic variants of spider venom as a new means of creating sustainable insecticides. Barracks is one of my companies, which does pheromone traps. Right? If you look at big data, Farmeron is backed by Dave McClure, who's speaking here on Wednesday, the loudest mouth VC you'll ever meet, maybe myself excluded, but is working on using cloud technology to manage dairy farms. Skymet, one of my portfolio companies, which is the Climate Corporation, but focused on India. Precision agriculture, Robot. Robot is a robot, go figure, that goes through fields of corn and does variable rate fertilizer, right? Without any human being having to do it. Blue River is doing the same thing of using automation for harvesting. Farmer's Edge. In innovative foods, two huge startups backed out of Silicon Valley, right, is Beyond Meat and Hampton Creek, which is Beyond Eggs, essentially creating substitutes for non-vegetarian, for eggs and for chicken, where you can't tell that you're not eating what you thought you were eating. But it puts a lot of relief on the agricultural system, where obviously animal agriculture is one of the major drains. And finally, from an investor perspective, we have something that in the last few years has taken off, which is exits. And not just small exits, huge exits, right? Climate Corporation was acquired by Monsanto for $1 billion. Athenix, AgriQuest, which was acquired by Bayer, Pasturia in the nematode space, Evolution Fresh, which was acquired by Starbucks in juices, Precision Planting, again, acquired by Monsanto. A lot of these are strategic exits. You haven't seen too many, aside from Marone, IPOs, but you're seeing a takeoff in this space globally, and I want everyone here who is an investor to become aware of it, because you're going to start seeing more and more billion-dollar companies coming out of this. Now, I'm going to do my plug in 1 minute. Next slide, please. So who are we? We're India's first agricultural and food technology venture fund. What do? We do technologies for farm productivity, ag sustainability, supply chain modernization, and we do innovative foods. And essentially what we believe is that the transformation of agriculture in India is not going to be driven by the government. By the way, when the new government comes, please come teach them how to reform an agricultural system, because you are a decade ahead of them. It's not going to be driven by NGOs that whine about every new technology. And we don't even think it's going to be driven by large corporates that, for the most part, right, don't invest, at least in India, heavily in R&D. We think it's going to be startups that drive that transformation. Next slide. Our major themes, again, similar to what you saw before: farm mech, sustainable inputs, big data, Internet of Things, supply chain tech, innovative food products, and aquaculture and livestock. Final slide. What are we fundamentally doing? What are we building on here in India? We're building on the fact, and nobody realizes this, that India is a sleeping giant in agriculture. Yes, everyone knows we're a top 3 to top 5 producer in everything. But simple statistic, if India produced the highest Indian yield, not the highest global yield, in every crop that it's in wheat, in rice, in sugarcane, in corn, in soya, we would more than double our global production. We would drop about 250 to 300 million tons of grain on the global system. You want to solve food security? Boom, I just solved half of it, right? Right there. So what are we doing? We are taking advantage of the strengths that India has. What do we have? Basically the best IT, hardware and software engineers, talent, right, and companies in the world. We're taking advantage of the fact that there's a huge amount of talent in biotech, and we're taking advantage of the fact that India is a proxy for smallholder agriculture globally. What we build here works in Nigeria, what we build here works in Indonesia. We have the advantage of the university systems, the talent, and the professional managerial core. We can build better startups out of here to solve global food security, starting with India, but going outside of it. That's a snapshot of the startups that we funded. It's a very national footprint. I've talked too long. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Our last speaker is Mike Vellings, is founder and managing partner of AquaSpark, entrepreneur, aquaculture, working on both the sustainability side of things, on the protein gap, to come up with startups that are commercially successful and sustainable. I was at the ASEAN panel this morning, and they said that the fish stocks in the seas around Indonesia are at only 7 to 10% of what they were 20, 30 years ago. Yes. And that as a result, there's 35% stunting in Indonesia due to that. I don't know if that's true, but I was stunned by that. So what you're doing is extremely important. And
thank you, Ken. It's not a lot of people know what's going on with seafood and seafood demand. I'd love to tell you a little bit more about it. Thank you for the chance to be on the panel. Could I have slide 31 now, please? So I'm Mike Vellings, partner, founder of AquaSpark. We're in the business of investing in sustainable aquaculture. Aquaculture is fish farming, the farming of aquatic plants, shellfish, and aquaculture is the most resource efficient and the most resource efficient animal protein that we can grow aside from insects, and with the smallest environmental footprint. If I could have the next slide, please. Not a lot of people know what's going on exactly in seafood. Aquaculture, fish farming, hasn't been around all that long, has been growing quite a bit. But if you look at the current situation, then you see that demand for seafood in the next 35 years is going to go up with 100 million metric tons globally. To put that in perspective, if you look at what the current output of all the wild catch fisheries globally for human consumption is, that's only 65 million metric tons. So we're talking about 2 times the current global wild catch in seafood. And that's not going to come out of the ocean. As Ken just said, the oceans are in most places heavily overfished. Some areas it's a little better, but it's definitely not going to solve the problem. If at best in the future we will be able to get the same amount of fish out of the ocean, but definitely not more than what we do today. So the only answer is basically farming. If I could have the next slide, please. Aquaculture has had a bad reputation so far. It's been good and bad. But if you look at current technology and where we stand today, it's not necessary anymore. There's a lot of exciting new technology around where people have been working on for a decade and a half that are capable of solving the issue of sustainable aquaculture. There's closed RES systems where you can grow fish without any runoff. There's a lot of new technology with growing multiple species next to each other where you mimic nature. There's big resource problems. Most fish eat fish. And to feed those fish, you use anchovies, sardines, menhaden. Most of that come from South America. It's one of the most unsustainable fisheries we have on the planet. But the biggest problem is that there's no more than we have today. And we need 2.5 times as much in the next 35 years. There's only a few ways to solve that. And one of them is to grow insects. Flies and maggots are natural feed for example, salmon. And that could be a great way to solve the problem. We think that we need a global approach to arrive at a point where we have local food security. To solve this issue, and to be able to battle and resist climate change and unpredictable weather, we would do a lot better with having a lot of small to medium enterprises all over the globe, sturdy businesses, instead of just a few really big ones. If I could have the next slide, please. So to do that, we developed this approach of building an ecosystem. We set up an evergreen fund, an open structure that can grow over time, where we will invest in an ecosystem of companies that benefit from each other all over the globe, across species, best-in-class farming operations and hatcheries, and then combine them, for example, with access to market, combine it with access to high-quality feed at a reasonable price, where you can get to a situation where we can go to a farming operation, say in Africa, and say, hey, we have a money investment for you because you have a really good company. We have 50 of the world's best experts to help you tinker your business into something better. And by the way, we also have access to market for you. And we have access to companies that can help you use less antibiotics, et cetera, et cetera. And if you think about small and medium enterprises, if you think that's not going to bring a big return, you're absolutely wrong. There's 3 examples on the slides. One is a fish farming operation that we're really excited about. The current owners already invested over 20 million euros. Would bring a return to the fund of 35% annually. Insect farming we're looking at the moment, if that proposition would work out, is 60% investment return. For example, a seaweed farming operation we're looking at is 45%. There's good returns and equitable returns for everybody involved. If I could have the next slide, please. One back. It's imperative that this happens. We have to grow those 100 million tons of fish. If we don't, we have to revert to another source of animal protein, like, for example, beef. And if you compare beef with fish, 1 kilo of beef needs between, depending on the beef, 8 and 35 kilos of feed for 1 kilo of beef, and it needs 8,000 liters of water. If you compare that to 1 kilo of tilapia, you need 1.4 kilos of feed and no water. Fish swim in it, but they don't drink it. So you clean the water and you use it again. There's 55 million jobs at the moment in the seafood industry globally. If that industry has to almost double, you can imagine how many new, resilient, good jobs will be created, half of them women. And we think with this more holistic approach of an ecosystem instead of old-fashioned a myopic approach where you say, well, we do one farm and build it as big as possible and go for economies of scale. We think this will work way better for our future. Thank you, Ken.
Okay, thank you. So when I became an American diplomat in 1968, you can imagine my dreams were I'm going to London or Paris. And instead, I ended up working in villages in the Mekong Delta of Vietnam. But I saw there what can happen when all of these things that were talked about came together. With the government put in infrastructure and policies, companies came and invested with extension, worked with. There was new miracle rice that had been developed through research that showed up. Well, now a farmer could get double the crops and had enough then to take better care of his family, uplift him out of poverty. Small investors started to come and do things, and an aquaculture developed along with it. So it's possible. And the question is, there's close to 1 billion people who are food insecure now, and another 2 billion going to be on the planet. Can we transform that Are we going to, what's the trend lines? And can we create those atmospheres so that the type of things that Mark's talked about, Doran, Mark and Mike have talked about can be possible? And that I want to, we have a few minutes left, or if there are a few questions from there or other comments from our panelists, please.
You spoke about this a little bit, and maybe for the minister, I'm just curious, certain foods are more environmentally efficient than other foods, but cultures are very dominant and people have preferences, and yet over time it seems inevitable that there's going to have to be a shift towards sustainable types of food. So how does one effectuate that, in order to make sure that over the next coming years, diets really shift to a place that's more environmentally sustainable?
Yeah, no, I think, first and foremost is one of the things why, excuse my voice, you don't have that much of environmentally sustainable production today is that productivity of agriculture in Africa is very low. You take a look at in terms of level of use of fertilizers is only about 13 kilograms per hectare compared to global average of about 135 kilograms per hectare. So many people worry about, well, you don't want Africa to use a lot of inorganic fertilizers. Well, the point is, if they don't, they'll cut down more forest than ever before. And so the problem in Africa is really about serious soil nutrient depletion. And so you really have to fix that particular problem. So I just want to be clear that people make that confusion that, it's almost as if what they're doing in Netherlands was going to be done in Africa. No, if you have two people, somebody's got to lose weight, the other person has to gain weight. They both have weight problems, but their solutions are not the same. Second is the fact that we really have to begin to get more efficient in use of water. And I think it was mentioned here, getting more grain or more food, per drop of water. Because water is going to be one of our most limiting factors, given the fact that we have climate change. And third is the fact that we also do need to use a lot more organic inputs than before. I mean, take, for example, the planting of trees, so you can have a lot more carbon sequestration within the soil. That's very, very important. Animal manure, crop manure, green manures are very important in improving the structure of the soil. So I think it's not just going to be one solution, one size fits all, that we have to look and make sure that we are using inputs that are produced within the farm, that we are also efficient in using water, which is very, very important for us to do. But I also want to say that at one point that you mentioned about this issue of precision farming, it doesn't really have to do with just large farms. You can have precision farming even with very, very small farms. And that's the angle of extension. Having good extension workers that can tell farmers that, okay, here's the kind of soil organic matter level you have. This is the kind of place you want to plant this crop. And that's very important in helping smallholder farmers to optimize what they have around their farms.
And we haven't talked about waste either. I mean, another way to make a significant increase in the food supply is cut down post-harvest waste, which is at about somewhere 1/3 or so of all the food that's produced doesn't get to a plate.
If I can make just on that, because I think it's a very important point the ambassador just raised. If you look at it, we have roughly 1.3 billion metric tons of food that's actually wasted per year. And that's 1/3 of all the food that we produce, right? And you throw up all the greenhouse emissions that comes from all of that. You wasted the water, you use up the land, you use up the labor, but then you throw the food away. In the United States alone, roughly $198 billion of food gets wasted every year. Most of it at the consumer end, right? All developed countries taken together, they probably lose about 280 million metric tons of food per year. That's more than all the food we produce in Africa, just like that. So I think that in developing countries and in developed countries, there has to be a concerted effort to make sure we reduce post-harvest losses. In developing countries, the critical things will be to have farm-level infrastructure, to have storage infrastructure, commodity exchanges, warehouse receipt systems can play a very big role with that. Even rural roads, like you mentioned, Ambassador, can play. Ambassador mentioned to me the first time we met that when he was in Vietnam, everywhere he went that they had roads, poverty levels went down, food security went up. Where you didn't have them, it was the inverse. So in Africa, if you don't have good roads, you can't really evacuate your produce when you need to quickly, so it gets rotten on your farm. But for developed countries, I think people have to do a better job of consumer planning so that they're not overbuying what they should buy. There has to also be a regulation, in my view, that companies should not just be throwing food away. If you have a food bank, those that need the food can get it. And there has to also be something about, well, if say, this thing expires by so date, it doesn't really mean that it has to expire by that date. And so when people go and they see it, they just leave it. So I think we need to have the regulatory agencies actually look at that because it contributes significantly to the amount of food waste we have in the world today.
Okay, I think question over here, a comment.
Mark, you mentioned Omnivore is a $50 million fund. In the great scheme of things, venture capital funds in the United States, $50 million is a rounding error. What kind of dollars are we looking at from the private investor sector to really make an impact on what it is that this panel is trying to do? Because my sense is unless you're accessing multiples of $50 million, there's not going to be the kind of solutions that the smart people are developing. Thank you.
What I would probably say in response to that is, generally speaking, in the venture capital industry, fund size and fund performance are inversely correlated. Big funds are dumb funds because they have to push more and more money into startups, and the quality of deals generally gets worse. If you look at, so that's not to say, so that is not to say that there isn't a lot more money or a lot more funds required in this space, but at the individual fund level, there is an optimal size of capital that a small team can deploy in a small number of startups and actually support that ecosystem well. What I would say is that you could probably in India have maybe, I'm speaking for India, in the United States and in Canada where there's about 7 ag tech funds, I would say collectively it's maybe $1 billion, three quarters of, maybe $750 million under management right now across those funds. I'm not necessarily sure if you pumped at the very early stage of the ecosystem more money in, you would get a better output. I think what is more required is that at the next level, a lot of us are doing Series A's and Series B's, maybe Series C's, but at that next level, that there are larger, right, for Series D's, for MES, for essentially the migration growth capital as it becomes more like private equity. There you need more money. You need more support. You need more of an ecosystem. But I think on the early stage of things, it's actually shaping up pretty well.
Okay. Question back.
I just had a question to follow on to that. Glenn Yago from the Milken Institute. Because one of the things that keeps coming up in so many of the labs that we do on development finance is not the issue only at the venture capital stage, which is a world of about $119 billion of investment, but how to win the race that the minister was talking about in terms of being able to deploy to overcome the massive potential threats to global growth because of insufficient food supply at the other valleys of death that exist at the project stage, or proving out the innovations of something like a Caima or some of the companies that you've identified from India, or some of the companies that are in Africa itself. And that's a lot of project financing. That's 300. Let me see. That's 32 trillion dollars in the debt markets of long-term private of fixed income money, which into projects which would deploy these technologies at a much more rapid space. So that seems to me, if we could identify, be it in fertilizer, be it in anything along the array that was in Mark's slide there, of being able to accelerate the deployment in aquaculture or wherever it might be, that seems to be the question that's challenging places like Nigeria or Kenya, Rwanda, and so forth, throughout Sub-Saharan, throughout Africa, and then in India and elsewhere. So I mean, the question is which would create the demand and pull demand in for these new technologies. So rather than just pushing it by money in the venture capital market, which is quite constrained to begin with.
I'll take a crack, and then I think a bunch of other people here probably want to take a crack. So just really fast, I said this morning at our breakfast. Projects is a dirty word. Okay, the world has had enough projects in agriculture. Okay, projects are what? Pardon me. Yeah, but this is not about infrastructure, right? Because the point here is that when you're talking about Nigeria, when you're talking about India, when you're talking about China, right? This is smallholder agriculture, so there's no way you can projectize it without dumping the government all over it and essentially watching that money vanish into the ether, right? The reason why startups work better for doing this is they build distribution networks that get product to market, that get product to farmer in a direct, low-cost way, rather than assuming that you can project finance this. Now, where I do think project finance is useful is at the national level, where overall agricultural finance, right, which allows the debt financing at the farmer level of inputs and machinery, right, of building out a new aquaculture pond, there it's very, very useful, right? But that's where I would emphasize it. Please, God, no more projects.
I think we've gotten the red flag.
Yes, we are out of
stop.
town.
So I just like the final point I would say is that, in my experience, that the amount of money that publicly and privately goes to research, and that is what will drive much of this, what's done and where it starts and filters down. And if we as a people and as a species and deal with this problem, can find ways to energize our governments, our universities, our institutions, and our private companies to be putting the money there, it will come down, and the things to which you can put money and the other kind of innovations that would come. It's my sense of it. Thank you all so much for being so attentive.